I'm David Adams, and I want you to come with me on an epic journey.
I'm fascinated by the rise of empires and the bitter, bloody dynastic struggles that tore them apart. Timur, the sword of Islam. Edgar, king of all the English. Attila the Hun, and Charlemagne, the father of Europe. All built vast empires that dominated our world before they fell, destroyed from within by vicious family infighting. In 10th century England, a king brings peace, but kills for love.
He ran him through with a javelin.
Enemies conspire against his son.
Is surrounded by armed men and is murdered.
And a royal rivalry proves fatal.
This skeleton tells the story of a brutal death.
The final outcome is bloodshed, betrayal, and the end of empire. England in the Age of Kings. A nation takes shape at a time of chivalry and bitter rivalry.
A 1,000 years ago, Anglo-Saxon England was under the threat of Viking invasion. Now, England was soon to be united under King Edgar. But here at Corfe Castle, his empire would begin to fall apart through a combination of murder, treachery, and a scheming stepmother. This is Edgar, the first king crowned ruler of all England. From 959, he transforms his kingdom by championing the rule of law and the influence of the church. Over the course of a 16-year reign, he brings stability to a country that's been locked in a life and death struggle with foreign invaders. It earns him the title Edgar the Peaceable. For over 300 years, England has been divided into 7 warring kingdoms. Edgar's family, the rulers of Wessex, unite this fragmented political landscape. And Edgar helps establish the identity of this new country. But when Edgar dies, a murderous family feud tears apart the kingdom he'd helped build from the ashes.
To understand the violent era his people had lived through when he became king, I've come to the island of Lindisfarne in the northeast of England. When monks built a monastery here, it became known as Holy Island. But this sacred place and the rest of the country faces a growing threat from across the North Sea. The Vikings, fierce pagan tribes from Scandinavia, have England in their sights, and its wealthy, undefended monasteries look like easy pickings.
A 150 years before Edgar, in 793, Vikings came ashore here for the first time. And what happened would reverberate right across England. This very special, very serene place is the site of a massacre.
Accounts from the time describe the shocking attack. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints and trampled on the bodies in the temple of God. Some they took away in fetters, many they drove out, and some they drowned in the sea.
These bloody raids lasted for almost 200 years. Absolutely terrified the local population.
The Vikings even started attacking the strongholds designed to protect the locals. One of the forts they targeted stood here, the site today of Bamborough Castle. This castle's blood-stained history was preserved when industrialist William Armstrong bought and restored the property in 1894.
So what was it like growing up in a castle?
It was fantastic, dude.
His 4 times great-nephew, William, inherited the castle and the name. Today he shares the story of his home by running it as a museum.
What do you think it was like for the people here when the Vikings came?
I think it would have been absolutely terrifying. I think the first time they came over the North Sea there and came to Lindisfarne, they wouldn't have known what was going on. And after that, every time they saw the ships coming over the horizon, they would have known what to expect, and it must have been terrifying for the local people.
Well, I would have thought they would have then crowded into the castle.
Yeah, and probably watched their homes being ransacked and burnt to the ground.
More than once, Bamborough falls into the hands of the invaders. Archaeologist Graham Young has spent 22 years uncovering evidence of the Viking presence here.
The arrival of the Vikings is a huge change for this place and for England. And what have you found here from that time?
We mostly find animal bone, charred seed remains, which allows us to reconstruct lifestyles and the feasting. But in terms of connecting us with Vikings, we do have one artifact that seems to be clearly Viking that came from Trench 1. And it's this item here, which is it appears to be a Thor's hammer, so it looks like a pagan amulet.
Wow.
Thor's hammer was the Vikings' most powerful religious symbol, a pagan rival to the crucifixes worn by the English. The wearer believed it offered them protection and power. And when Edgar becomes king, he will try and erase any trace of these non-Christian beliefs.
It doesn't look particularly English.
No, I mean, we should be a Christian kingdom from the middle part of the 7th century. So when you find something that seems to be particularly pagan from a later deposit, this surely must be some connection with the Vikings' presence in Northumbria.
Finding it here is a sign of how the Vikings went from hit-and-run raids to conquest and colonization. But Edgar's family leads the fight back. His great-grandfather, King Alfred, reinforces the country's defences, builds a navy to protect English waters, and halts his enemy's progress. Later, Edgar's uncle, King Athelstan, recaptures occupied land and repels another attempted invasion. Edgar is born into this world in 943. With high hopes, he'll build on these victories.
A leading churchman of the time, Abbot Dunstan, claims that he hears angels proclaiming that Edgar would bring peace to the land.
When Edgar is 11 years old, the last Viking ruler, Eric Bloodaxe, is driven out of England. And his death presents an opportunity to restore the stability and order that England has lacked.
At first, it doesn't look as though that chance will fall to Edgar. The heir to the throne is his older brother, Edwig. But less than 4 years into his reign, he dies, and Edgar gets his chance. As the new ruler, 16-year-old Edgar wastes no time in establishing his own royal family.
Edgar has 2 children with his first 2 wives, including his firstborn son, Edward. Each of these marriages ends, And then, 6 years into his reign, he meets the love of his life, Ealhsrith. She becomes an important political figure during Edgar's rule. They go on to have 2 sons, Edmund, who dies in infancy, and Ethelred. But this is a relationship that starts with a murder. I'm visiting the scene of this cold-blooded crime in the south of England, where it's marked by a monument called Dead Man's Pluck. Historian Elizabeth Norton believes the events that took place here reveal a violent side to Edgar the Peaceable.
So here we are approaching Dead Man's Pluck.
So why is this plaque so important to Edgar's story?
It was built in the early 19th century. Edgar was very popular in the Victorian period in particular, so they wanted to show the king in a positive light and also remember him. But what's interesting is what this plaque commemorates is a murder, one that the king was involved in.
It's the grisly ending to a love rivalry between Edgar and his best friend, Ethelwald, who's sent by the king to confirm rumours of a great beauty called Ealhsrith. On his return, Ethelwald lies to the king about her looks, so he can marry her instead. But Edgar is suspicious, and when he finally sees Ealhsrith for himself, he falls madly in love and realises that his friend now stands in his way.
And what this plaque commemorates is that he took Ethelwald out into the forest in the guise of a hunting trip and then ran him through with a javelin. The Victorians, anxious to portray Edgar in a positive light, say that it's all Ethelwald's fault, and they say that if Ethelwald had behaved himself and hadn't tricked the king in marrying Ealhsrith to himself, this wouldn't have happened.
So this is a very mercenary, clinically thinking guy, isn't he? He's not the benevolent man that we think he is.
There's no doubt about it. He set out to murder Ethelwald so he could marry his wife.
In affairs of the heart, Edgar is ruthless. And he will prove just as single-minded when it comes to affairs of state.
The ambitious Edgar believes it's his destiny to unite England. In his new wife, he finds not just a love match, but a partner to achieve his aims. But Ealhsrith has her own overwhelming ambition. She'll stop at nothing to ensure that her son inherits the throne from Edgar.
In 10th century England, King Edgar becomes ruler of a nation struggling to establish itself. The start of his reign sees a respite from the Viking invasions that have plagued England for over a century. The new king has an historic opportunity to bring the people of England together and establish order where there's been instability and fear. He doesn't tackle this task alone. At his side is his third wife, Ealhsrith. They marry after Edgar kills a love rival, which raises a vital question about their relationship. If a king commits murder for his wife, what else is he prepared to do for her? Part of the answer is found here in the British Library. Historian Rory Naismith believes Ealhsrith's influence over matters of state was unprecedented.
So what was Edgar and Ealhsrith like as a couple?
In many ways, they're the 10th century power couple. They marry in the mid-960s. Ealhsrith is the third of Edgar's wives, but she's the one who's treated in the most special, most queenly way. Clearly, she's right at the heart of the royal regime.
She's really powerful.
She is. She's very powerful indeed. But being a powerful woman in this period, in the 10th century, was also a certain amount of risk. It was a liability because people could see you as wielding power inappropriately.
Prominent women may have been viewed with suspicion. But that didn't stop Ealhsrith, and the evidence of her political influence is found in one of the library's oldest books. It records her direct involvement in the sweeping changes Edgar makes to the country.
This book is a real monument to history. It's almost 1,000 years old, and in working on this subject for more than 10 years, I've never actually had the privilege of seeing it in the flesh before. So it's a real
This is the first time you've actually seen the book?
It is indeed. It's a real
Wow.
treat to be here today.
Why is this book so important to English history?
It's important because it's the Regulars Concordia, the monastic agreement, which lays down a common set of rules and practices for all of the monasteries and nunneries that have recently been set up in England, bringing all of them together, getting everyone almost literally singing from the same hymn sheet.
Oh, really? And how does that take us into Edgar's story and Aelfrith?
Well, this arrangement was set up by Edgar and Aelfrith working in tandem.
These pages contain Edgar's blueprint for transforming the church and the country along with it. Years of Viking attacks had destabilized the church, draining finances and decimating its monastic communities. These are the guidelines for stopping that decline and enforcing a stricter, more devout religious practice. And the king and the queen are at the heart of this change.
And you can actually see both of their names on this page, Edgar up here and Aelfrith further on towards the bottom, where we're being told about how the king and queen have come together to support and protect the monks and the nuns as a group. So it's all about king, queen, nation and church working as a unit.
And that hadn't happened before?
Not like this, no.
It's a powerful new alliance that will increase Edgar's control over the kingdom. The reforms also contain a further clue to Aelfrith's ambitions, suggesting that she wants to influence not just the day-to-day running of the country, but its future too, by putting her children in pole position to inherit power.
And as we near the end of it, we have a list of all the people who were involved in that process, who witnessed the act that it was based on. And from that list, we get a wonderful insight into the royal establishment as it was at that stage over 1,000 years ago, including the prominence of Aelfrith's children, as opposed to those of Edgar's earlier wives.
So that really then sets up the battle for the succession?
It does, yes. It shows how you got this powder keg on which everyone's sitting.
For the time being, though, Edgar hopes his plan will strengthen his position and bring stability to the country.
These reforms are not only about faith, they're about politics too. Edgar is building a powerful alliance. By strengthening the church, he's increasing his own power base as well. Edgar's biggest supporter is one of the most powerful religious figures of the time, Archbishop Dunstan. A deeply pious man, he's declared a saint soon after he dies. One of the keys to the reforms is taking land away from the nobility and using it for new monasteries. This strengthens Edgar's support with the church, but creates new enemies with the nobility. Together, though, Dunstan and Edgar resist their opponents and see the changes through.
40 new monasteries are founded and restored across the land, all the way to the southern coast. With church and state in control, law and order slowly returns, and 20 years go by without foreign attack. With England united behind Edgar, the risk for the Vikings of launching any new raids outweighs the reward. His achievements call for a celebration, and in Dunstan, the king has the perfect advisor to plan a display of majestic power and grandeur. After 14 years on the throne, Edgar decides it's time for a formal coronation. And the city of Bath, with its echoes of the glorious Roman Empire, is the perfect setting.
Now, when you come here, you're immediately transported back to the power and might of the Roman days. And I think when Edgar was here, probably swimming in this bath, he would have thought exactly the same. It was time for a grand show.
The ceremony is held here in Bath Abbey. Edgar's two closest allies play an important part in this momentous occasion. Dunstan, the Archbishop of Canterbury, conducts the coronation, anointing Edgar a holy king, ordained by God. And Edgar's great love, Aelfrith, is crowned alongside him, becoming the first ever English queen. Archbishop Dunstan creates an elaborate order of ceremony, which becomes the standard for all English monarchs from Edgar to Elizabeth II. It's the greatest royal occasion yet recorded in English history.
If you want to know what it was like at Edgar's coronation, then the best place to come is here at Hurstmonceux in East Sussex. It's 3 days of jousting, feasting and fighting, and generally celebrating English history.
But to unite a kingdom, pomp and circumstance are not enough on their own. To establish his authority over the Welsh, Edgar puts on a show of force. He marches his army along the Welsh border from Bath to Chester and orders his navy to set sail and demonstrate his command of the Irish Sea.
As the army and navy descend on Chester, 6 British kings arrive for a ceremony that will glorify King Edgar's authority. Now, legend has it that they rowed up this river together as a sign of unity. Now, it's pretty hard to imagine what that day would have been like. But here in Chester, the people still love to celebrate on the river.
The city's annual charity raft race draws big crowds and competitors that don't hold back. Over 1,000 years ago, the 6 kings arrive right here, board the royal barge and row Edgar down the river. They come ashore and enter St. John the Baptist Church, where Edgar asks the kings to pledge allegiance to him. Reverend David Chester is the church minister and an expert in its rich history. He believes the events that take place here capture Edgar at the peak of his powers.
So why did they choose this church?
This was probably the most important church in the north of England, and it was here that Edgar came to really consolidate his power. We are at a pivotal moment in English history when sub-kings were either going to give the king allegiance or they were going to discuss with him the management of the realm. Here is Edgar consolidating his power. Rex Angelorum, the king of the English, this point in time is so important.
The year is 973, and one ruler has united all of England and secured support from leaders beyond its borders too.
And then something happens that will rock this newly united realm to its foundations. Just as it reaches its crowning glory, King Edgar dies.
It's 16 years since he took power, and only 2 years since his coronation. He leaves behind a united kingdom, but unanswered questions over who should now rule it. Edgar's powerful widow Elthryth doesn't want anyone but her surviving son, Ethelred, on the throne. This obsession will tear Edgar's family and the kingdom apart. When families do battle over the throne, the end result can be the end of empire. In 10th century England, King Edgar forges a powerful alliance with the church and restores law and order throughout the land. This new era of peace sees England flourish. But when Edgar dies, he leaves behind 2 sons, each with a claim to the kingdom. His widow Elthryth had long wanted her son, Athelred, to inherit the throne. But Edward, the eldest son from an earlier marriage, also has strong support. It's a dispute set to destabilize a country that a legendary king had defended 4 centuries earlier.
Well, this is what remains of Glastonbury Abbey. This is where the legends of King Arthur and Guinevere spring from. That's actually reputed to be King Arthur's tomb. Now, I can understand why Edgar would want to be buried here amongst the legends of King Arthur's tales. But the thing about Edgar is that we don't actually know where he's buried. There's no gravestone or tomb. It's one of the big mysteries.
The biggest question he leaves behind, though, is who should succeed him. According to historian Michael Costin, there was no clear-cut answer.
The question of how the succession was to be organised was quite a difficult one because there weren't any rules about who should be king. It wasn't automatically a case, as it later became, that the eldest son succeeded. Far from it. There were suggestions that Edward was actually illegitimate. 2 things to say about that. The first is that this may well have been a rumour put around by Elthryth in order to promote her son over Edward, which is, I think, understandable. The other thing to say about it is that illegitimacy was not then the stain, as you might say, that it later becomes. Many illegitimate children succeeded to thrones.
But what's really behind the battle for succession is land. The land that Edgar and his queen took from the nobles to restore the monasteries and to reform the church. And it's this that's dividing the country.
In the turmoil following his death in 975, Edgar's great alliance of church and state breaks down into rival factions. Many nobles are still angry at losing land during the church reforms. They believe the best chance of getting it back is with 8-year-old Ethelred on the throne. Edgar's great ally, Archbishop Dunstan, is backing Edward's claim, believing he will make sure the disputed land remains in church hands. The uncertainty causes turmoil. England desperately needs a new leader.
In the end, it all comes down to age. Edward is in his teens, while Ethelred is only 7 years old.
Dunstan, the powerful churchman, gets his wish, and Edward is crowned king. But the dispute rumbles on as nobles and clergy meet in the Wiltshire village of Caen. Today, Caen is a sleepy little town, but at the time, it had a royal hall where the country's power brokers would meet. Local historian Terry Couchman believes that here, an act of God may have settled the clash over Edward's rule once and for all.
And so what actually happened on that day?
Well, Basically, it was a witan, and a witan is a meeting of the wise, state and the clergy and so on. And Dunstan raises his hands and asks for God's guidance, and all of a sudden the floor gives way under all the assembly, except for Dunstan, who stood on a beam. So
it sounds very suspicious.
It does sound suspicious, but the story goes that that was the decision. Everyone trusted that this was a clear indication from God.
The collapsed floor leaves many dead and others badly injured. And if God had saved Archbishop Dunstan, the thinking went, then his support for King Edward and the land reforms must also have divine approval. Edward is now the undisputed power in the land and perfectly placed to eliminate any rivals. Perhaps sensing danger, Aelfrith leaves the royal court for an estate on the south coast, taking her son Ethelred with her. It's thought Corfe Castle stands on the site they retreated to. It's the perfect location for someone with enemies. Up high, with excellent lines of sight, making it impossible to approach without being spotted. That doesn't stop the king. 3 years into his reign, 15-year-old Edward pays his stepmother and half-brother a visit. Their fate hangs in the balance. But as it turns out, they aren't the ones in danger. One account describes the king arriving at the grounds to be welcomed with a cup of mead. It's at that moment that his attackers strike.
Edward, King of England, is surrounded by armed men right here and is murdered. Now, what intrigues me is he would have been travelling with a huge body of men. I mean, he was the King of England. So what happened to those men? Why didn't they defend him? They must have been complicit in the murder plot. It all points to Aelfrith. The young heir just wasn't old enough. He was 11 years old. He couldn't have been part of it. She had everything to gain and nothing to lose. Edward's murder is recorded in second-hand accounts of the time, but a more forensic analysis of his fate takes place many centuries later. An archaeological dig unearths his remains in a casket. And in 1970, a prominent physician, Thomas Stowell, performs a long-delayed post-mortem. Stowell examines a skeleton that shows clear signs of violence. The left thigh bone is fractured, consistent with being suddenly dragged down from the saddle. Edward's left arm is broken, and his spine has a nick in it which suggests a stab wound. Stowell speculates that as Edward is pulled from his saddle, his foot gets caught in the stirrup, and as the horse bolts, he's dragged across the ground, causing severe trauma to the skull. This skeleton tells the story of a brutal death.
But Edward proves to have a greater influence in death than he ever did in life.
After the murder, Edward's body is buried in a small grave with no ceremony. Now, many believe this was Aelfrith not wanting any fuss to be made about his gravesite, but it backfires. People come from all over the country because miracles start to happen. They say that beams came down from the sky and illuminated the grave. That a year later, she has his body moved. It's carried through the countryside from village to village, and people mark the sides of the roads. More miracles happen. This is the beginning of the cult of Edward the Martyr. The body's brought here to Shaftesbury Abbey in Dorset, and Archbishop Dunstan performs a full burial service for Edward. This place becomes a centre of pilgrimage for Edward the Martyr. Meanwhile, Ethelred has taken the throne. He's just 11 years old, but it's not going well. Suspicion for Edward's death falls on his mother, and the people aren't happy. Revolution is in the wind.
Great empires often fall in the wake of vicious family power struggles. In the 10th century, King Edgar brings peace and stability to England, but his death triggers a bitter dispute. Edgar's powerful widow, Elthryth, wants to install her son, Ethelred, on the throne. Instead, his half-brother Edward becomes king. But 3 years into his reign, he's murdered. And Ethelred finally takes power. At last, his mother's ambitions are realised.
But Ethelred rules under a cloud of suspicion. Many believe Elthryth is behind the murder. At first, she helps rule on behalf of her 11-year-old son. But as he grows up, he begins to distance himself from his mother. And eventually, he removes her from court altogether.
Elthryth has lost her grip on power, and soon her son will too. He's unable to reach a decision without consulting his advisors, but they counsel him badly. His indecision and poor judgment earns him the nickname Ethelred the Unready. He falls well short of his great-grandfather, Alfred, the most celebrated king from his ancestral line.
This is a statue of Alfred the Great. He actually built this abbey. Now, I can't help wondering what he would have thought of all this. And I expect, by the look on his face, he was probably turning in his grave. The empire that he'd helped create was now falling away. We're about to enter a truly disastrous period of English history.
The growing chaos under Ethelred's rule doesn't go unnoticed. Just a few kilometres beyond England's southern coastline, the Vikings are poised to attack again.
The need to defend England's coastline goes back right through the ages. These pillboxes were built to repel a Nazi invasion in the Second World War. And all across these hills, there's the remains of Saxon fortresses. At the end of the 10th century, England lay open and exposed, and the Vikings knew it. And from their bases, just across the Channel in France, a second wave of invasions swept over England. There were two types of Vikings that came to England. Those that came to conquer and take land, and those that demanded payment to sail away.
Paying off the Vikings isn't cheap, and Ethelred is forced to tax the nobility to raise funds. The tax becomes known as Danegeld. In only a few years, it rises to an extortionate 22,000 kilos of silver. And English towns are still being raided.
Ethelred is under enormous pressure. He turns his anger to the peaceful Danish settlers within the kingdom. Some of them have been living in England for more than 3 generations. But Ethelred becomes convinced that they're plotting to overthrow him, and he orders their massacre.
One of those murdered is the sister of the Viking king, Sweyn Forkbeard. Forkbeard swears revenge.
In a series of raids, he burns down English towns, and in 1013, he launches a full-scale invasion. English ships take up positions on the Thames, ready to defend the kingdom. But Forkbeard has his sights set elsewhere, and he sails up the east coast, aiming for the north instead. Most of the local leaders withdraw their support for Ethelred, submitting to the Viking king before a sword is even drawn. Ethelred abandons his people. He escapes across the Channel to France. It's a dark day in English history. Forkbeard's mission to avenge his sister has turned into a triumphant conquest, and now he looks set to become the new king of England.
But Forkbeard is never crowned. He dies in the months following his victory, after falling from his horse. It gives Ethelred an unexpected second chance to save the kingdom and his royal line. He hangs on to power for 2 more years, until aged around 50, he dies, exhausted, according to one account, from years of great toil and difficulties.
Ethelred was buried here on the site of Old St. Paul's Cathedral. But there's nothing left of the grave. It was destroyed in the Great Fire of London. In fact, churches here have been burned down 5 times, and one of them was at the hands of the Vikings.
The defence of the failing kingdom now falls to Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside. It's the last chance to stop Edgar's achievements from disappearing. He faces another formidable Viking enemy, Forkbeard's son, Canute. He invades with a fleet of over 200 longships, and for months, Ironside and Canute fight a series of fierce battles across the kingdom. Canute is a new breed of Viking, a Christian convert. Rather than destroy the kingdom, he wants to preserve much of it. Canute will go on to rebuild monasteries ransacked by his countrymen and uphold the laws introduced by King Edgar. He will even marry Ethelred's widow. Behind his invasion lies a respect for England and its institutions. Canute seizes control of a number of towns, but one city holds out. London is still under Ironside's control. The last remaining piece of the great nation that Edgar had helped establish.
In an attempt to secure the city, Ironside refortifies these ancient Roman walls. But Canute lays siege in a bloody campaign that lasts for months. And in the end, the Vikings take London. And Canute is crowned King of the English. It's the end of Edgar's empire, and it's the end of the Age of Kings.